All right, so you enjoy a good philosophical puzzle, right? I bet you do. Well, we're about to tackle a real head-scratcher today, straight from the 17th century.
Ooh, sounds intriguing.
It is. We're going to delve into the work of Louis de Laforge.
Laforge.
Yeah, he's a pretty fascinating figure, deeply connected to Descartes, and we're going to grapple with a challenge that really preoccupied him. It's a question that has haunted philosophers for ages. How in the world do our minds and bodies actually interact? I mean, on the surface, it seems so simple. You think, move my hand, and boom, it moves.
Right, like it's automatic.
Exactly. But Laforge, and he wasn't alone in this, saw a huge chasm there, a real mystery.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem. It seems straightforward, but when you really think about it, how does something immaterial, like a thought, cause something physical to happen?
That's exactly the puzzle. It's this mind-body problem that's captivated thinkers for centuries. And that's what we're diving into today. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Louis de Laforge as our guide.
Okay, so we've got our source material. What exactly are we hoping to uncover in this deep dive?
We're going to explore how Laforge tried to solve this mind-body puzzle. He had a really interesting approach, using a mechanical view of the world, like the universe, and our bodies are like machines.
A mechanical view. That's a pretty bold approach for the 17th century.
It was, and he was committed to the idea of an immaterial soul, too. We're going to see how he brought all these ideas together. It's a wild ride, trust me.
Yeah.
So first things first, who is this Louis de Laforge? The name might not ring a bell for everyone.
Fair enough. Laforge, born in 1632, interestingly enough, came from the same town as Descartes, La Flèche. He started his career as a medical doctor, which probably had a big influence on his thinking, especially his view of the body as a kind of mechanism.
Like seeing the body as a complex machine with all its parts working together.
Exactly. Then he moved to Saumur, which is a town that, interestingly enough, had both Huguenot and Oratorian schools that were pretty open to Cartesian ideas. It was like a hub for these new ways of thinking.
A real melting pot of ideas. So he's rubbing shoulders with other thinkers who are into Descartes.
Precisely. He was in dialogue with other philosophers there, folks like Robert Chouet, and he also exchanged letters with other leading Cartesians like Giraud de Cordemoy. It was a vibrant intellectual scene.
Now, we know he was deeply involved with Descartes' legacy, even editing some of his unpublished works. Would you say he saw himself primarily as an interpreter of Descartes? Or did he try to carve his own path, even disagreeing with Descartes when he felt it was necessary?
That's a good question. I think it was a bit of both. He certainly played a crucial role in bringing Descartes' work to light, especially after Descartes died in 1650. He was even involved in publishing some of Descartes' unfinished physiological writings. We're talking about the Traité de l'Homme and Description du Corps humain. He even added his own illustrations and extensive notes to these works, which were published as Remarques in 1664.
Wow, so he was deeply immersed in Descartes' thinking, trying to understand and clarify it for others.
Absolutely. But he wasn't just a passive follower. He actively engaged with Descartes' ideas, developing his own interpretations, and, yes, sometimes even critiquing Descartes' views.
That's what I'm interested in. What were some of Laforge's own unique contributions to this philosophical landscape?
Well, one of his most significant works was published in 1666, the same year he died, sadly, at the very young age of 33. It was the first book-length study focused specifically on Descartes' theory of the human mind, called the Traité de l'Esprit de l'Homme.
And this is where he lays out his own distinctive take on substance dualism, right?
Exactly. And even more importantly for our discussion today, this is where he presents his theory of occasional causation, which is a really key piece of the puzzle when we're talking about mind-body interaction.
Occasional causation, that's the concept we'll definitely need to unpack. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a step back and consider the intellectual context Laforge was working in. What were the dominant explanations for how the world worked, and what did he find so unsatisfactory about them?
Okay, so back then, one of the main approaches inherited from the scholastic tradition was to explain things by appealing to what they called faculties or powers. Basically, they would say things have certain inherent abilities to do stuff.
Like a kind of built-in potential to act in certain ways.
Yeah, exactly. And Laforge, following in Descartes' footsteps, was very critical of this. He thought these faculties were just empty words, placeholders that didn't really explain anything.
So they were just giving fancy names to things without actually explaining how they worked.
Precisely. He even gave some great examples to illustrate his point. Like, physicians at the time would often explain the beating of the heart by referring to a pulsific faculty of the soul.
A pulsific faculty doesn't sound very scientific.
Not at all. And Laforge's point was, sure, you can say the heart beats, so it must have a faculty of beating. But simply naming it doesn't tell us anything about how it actually works.
So it's just a description, not a real explanation.
Right. He argued it's like saying diarrhea happens because of an expulsive faculty of the intestines when they get irritated. Or maybe it's a weak retentive faculty. He felt like these were just fancy ways of saying, we don't really know.
Like labeling a black box. It's there, it does something, but we don't know what's going on inside.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. It's clear he was pushing for a more rigorous, mechanistic understanding of the world, even back then.
It sounds like he was ahead of his time in a way.
He was. This dissatisfaction with these vague faculties led him to embrace a very different approach, what we call the mechanical philosophy.
The idea that the universe, including our bodies, is like a complex machine operating according to the laws of physics.
Exactly. And Laforge was a strong advocate for this Cartesian model, where everything is made up of matter in motion, interacting through contact, and governed by these mechanical principles.
So no more mysterious faculties. Everything's explained by the movement and interaction of physical parts.
That's the idea. And for Laforge, this meant viewing animal behavior and even human bodily functions as analogous to automata, like complex clocks or other mechanical devices.
Okay, so he's applying this mechanistic model to the body, which in some ways seems pretty intuitive. But we know Descartes and his followers, including Laforge, often talked about things we can't directly observe, like Descartes' famous animal spirits. How did Laforge deal with that potential criticism? It seems like they're just replacing one set of invisible entities with another.
That's a sharp observation. Laforge recognized this potential critique. He acknowledged that their model did involve positing unobservable things, but he argued that we accept unobservable phenomena all the time as long as they have a strong explanatory power.
Like, we don't see gravity, but we accept it because it explains why things fall.
Exactly. He used the example of the sun and the moon appearing to move across the sky. We don't see the Earth rotating on its axis, but that invisible movement makes sense of what we observe.
So it's not about whether something's directly visible, but whether it fits into a coherent and explanatory picture of the world.
Right. And he even went further, proposing specific criteria for when it's reasonable to accept hypotheses involving these unobservable entities.
What were some of those criteria? It sounds like he was trying to be quite rigorous in his approach.
He argued that a good hypothesis should explain things clearly and simply. It shouldn't contradict what our senses tell us, and there shouldn't be any other more plausible explanations. He also said it should be logically deducible from well-established principles and be able to explain multiple different effects.
So he was looking for explanations that were comprehensive, consistent with our observations, and logically sound. That makes sense.
Yeah, he was going for explanatory power and coherence.
Okay, so we've got this mechanical picture of the body, but what about the mind? We know Laforge was a strong dualist, meaning he believed the mind and body are fundamentally different kinds of things.
Absolutely. He was one of the first to explicitly attribute a clear mind-body dualism to Descartes. Substance dualism basically says that the mind is immaterial, meaning it's not made of physical stuff, and it's characterized by thought, while the body is material, extended in space, and governed by the laws of physics.
So two fundamentally different realms.
Right. And Laforge even defined a substance as something in which a property resides immediately. He then took that mechanical model we've been talking about and applied it to explain all animal actions and even a lot of human bodily functions. He even initially used the term ideas to refer to what we now call brain states.
So he's trying to explain even the physical processes of the brain in mechanistic terms.
Exactly. He talked about how ideas arise in the brain, how memory works as a kind of physical trace, and how imagination involves the reactivation of these traces by animal spirits, which he imagined as working like a kind of hydraulic system.
Wow, so even the workings of the brain, at least on a physical level, are understood as mechanical processes. But where does the mind, the material mind, fit into all of this?
That's the key distinction. Later on, in his treatise, Laforge actually refined his terminology a bit. He started using the term idea to refer specifically to thoughts in the immaterial mind, and he called those physical brain states corporeal species.
So, corporeal species are the physical traces or representations in the brain.
That's right. But for Laforge, actual thinking, conscious thought, that was solely the domain of this immaterial mind.
So how did he argue for the existence of this immaterial mind? What were its defining features?
He drew some interesting parallels with Augustine's thinking. LaForge argued that the mind is a distinct substance that's capable of surviving the death of the body, and its key characteristics, its defining properties, are understanding and willing.
The ability to think and to choose. That makes sense.
He even argued that our ability to understand, to grasp concepts, can go beyond our direct sensory experience. He said we can conceive of things we've never seen or touched or heard, which suggests that the mind isn't entirely dependent on the physical body.
Like imagining a color you've never seen before, or a sound you've never heard. That does seem to point to something beyond the purely physical.
Right. And he even said pure understanding is as independent of the body as the will is. They both operate in a realm beyond the material.
Okay, so where do these ideas in the mind come from? We know he was influenced by Descartes on this.
He was. He proposed that ideas arise in two main ways. Either they're triggered by our senses, by what we perceive in the world, or they arise independently from within the mind itself. And this is where he picks up on Descartes' idea of innate ideas.
So the idea that we're born with certain fundamental concepts already present in our minds.
That's the gist of it. But LaForge clarified this by saying that the mind is the principal and effective cause of all its ideas, while the senses are just remote and occasional causes.
So ultimately, it's the mind that's generating these ideas, even if they're sometimes prompted by our senses.
Exactly. And this distinction, he argued, comes from the fundamental difference between mind and matter. They're just so different in their nature that they can't directly cause each other.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question. If the mind and body are so different, how do they possibly interact? This is the problem that famously stumped Descartes.
You're absolutely right. And it's a problem that any substance dualist has to grapple with. LaForge recognized this challenge. He even talked about the mind and body forming a composite subject, a unity of composition and association. He described their union as a mutual and reciprocal dependence of thoughts on the movements of the other and in the mutual interaction of their actions and passions. He even used causal language, saying external bodies cause sensations and the mind can cause bodily movements.
But that's just describing the interaction, not explaining how it's possible. How does he square this causal language with his commitment to substance dualism? This is where occasionalism comes in, right?
You got it. LaForge is considered one of the early proponents of occasionalism. And this is where things get really interesting. But it's important to note that his version is often called partial occasionalism. He's not saying that God is the only cause in the universe.
So he's not going full-blown occasionalist like some later thinkers did.
Right. He focused mainly on the impossibility of motion transferring between physical bodies. He called it the non-transfer argument. Basically, he said motion is just a mode, a way of being that's inseparable from the body it belongs to.
So, like, the redness of an apple is inseparable from the apple itself. You can't have redness without an apple to be red.
Exactly. LaForge said the same thing about motion. You can't have motion without a body that's moving, and since it's inseparable from the body, it can't be transferred from one body to another.
Okay, so when one billiard ball hits another, he's saying the motion itself doesn't jump from one ball to the other. That's pretty mind-bending.
It is. But he distinguished this from motive force, which he saw as something separate from both the body being moved and the application of the force itself. He made a subtle distinction there.
So the force that causes motion is distinct from the motion itself. That's a tricky concept. How did he defend that?
Well, he argued that if the force moving a body is distinct from the body itself, and only bodies can be moved, then no body can actually move itself. If it could, that force wouldn't be distinct from the body. And if a body can't move itself, he said it certainly can't move another body.
So he's ruling out the possibility of bodies having some kind of internal power to move themselves.
Right. And from that, he concluded that anybody in motion must be pushed by something non-bodily, something entirely different from the physical world.
So if bodies can't directly cause each other to move, what's doing the pushing? I'm guessing this is where God comes in.
You're on the right track. He argued that all bodily movement needs a non-bodily cause. But he didn't stop there. He went on to say that finite minds, like our human minds, couldn't be the general cause of motion either.
So it's not us with our limited minds that are making the universe tick.
Nope. He brought in two main ideas to support this. First, he appealed to the concept of continuous creation, the idea that God is constantly creating and sustaining the universe. And second, he talked about the necessity of simultaneous movement in a plenum, which basically means that space is completely full of matter.
No gaps, no empty spaces.
Right. And he argued that if a single body tried to move, it would be pushing against all this other matter, and it wouldn't be able to move unless everything else moves simultaneously.
It'd be like trying to swim through a pool full of solid objects.
Exactly. So he concluded that the force that moves any one body must be the same force that moves all the other bodies at the same time, and that force, he said, is God's force.
So it's God who's ultimately responsible for all the motion in the universe. But what about the mind-body interaction? If God is the one moving our bodies, does that mean we don't have free will?
That's the big question, and it's one that Laforge took very seriously. To address it, he proposed that God has different ways of operating, different modus operandi when dealing with inert matter and active minds. He said that while everything ultimately depends on God, they depend on him in different ways.
So there's a difference between how God interacts with a rock, for example, and how he interacts with a thinking, willing mind.
Precisely. Laforge suggested that when our will isn't involved, God acts according to his own will. But when our will is involved, he takes our will into account. He sees how our will is going to decide and then brings about the corresponding effects in the physical world.
So it's like God sets up the system, but our will plays a role in determining the specific outcome. It's a kind of collaboration.
That's a good way to put it. Laforge viewed bodies and minds as particular causes that determine and compel God's application of force in accordance with the laws of nature.
It sounds like he's trying to carve out a space for human agency within this occasionalist framework.
He is. He even used the example of how a specific bodily movement might lead to a specific thought, and vice versa, to argue against the idea that God just does everything and our minds and bodies are just passive players.
He's saying there's a genuine interplay, a back and forth between mind and body.
Yeah, he's trying to capture that sense of interaction. So in the end, Laforge's view was that God's role in mind-body interaction is similar to his role in body-body interaction. He establishes the basic framework, the rules of the game, but the specific actions within that framework are influenced by both our physical states and our mental volitions.
Okay, so that's Laforge's take on occasional causation, at least as it applies to the mind-body problem. What about the broader impact of his ideas, particularly his non-transfer argument? Did those ideas have legs?
They did, to some extent. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions that Laforge's focus on the impossibility of motion transfer did spark some debate and was picked up by other philosophers. Figures like Antoine Lagrange adopted this idea in their Cartesian textbooks as a way to support occasionalism.
So his ideas were circulating and being taken seriously in philosophical circles.
They were. But there were also critics, of course. John Toland, for example, pushed back against the growing popularity of occasionalism. He called it a monstrous hypothesis, and he directly engaged with Laforge's non-transfer argument in his critiques.
So even if his specific theory didn't win everyone over, he was definitely pushing the boundaries of philosophical thinking about causation and mind-body interaction.
He was. He was tackling one of the biggest and most persistent questions in philosophy, and he offered a unique and complex solution that was deeply rooted in Cartesian physics and metaphysics.
Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive. We've explored the life and work of Louis de Laforge, a fascinating figure who grappled with the mind-body problem and offered his own solution in the form of partial occasionalism. He argued that the impossibility of motion transfer between physical bodies leads us to the conclusion that God must be the immediate cause of physical interactions, while still leaving room for finite minds to play a role in determining the course of events.
And his work leaves us with a lot to think about. It challenges our everyday assumptions about cause and effect, and it forces us to really examine the relationship between our thoughts and our actions.
If you're intrigued by these ideas and want to delve deeper, we highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Louis de Laforge. It's a great starting point for exploring his work, as well as the broader history of Cartesian philosophy and occasionalism.
And maybe Laforge's work can serve as a reminder that even the things that seem most obvious, like how we move our bodies, can raise profound philosophical questions about how the world really works. There's a lot more to reality than meets the eye, and Laforge's work helps us see that.
Food for thought, for sure. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.
Happy pondering.